alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome to today's episode of Ashura Reflections. Today, mysticism, the hidden and less manifested reality of Aba Abdallah, which you never see clearly. Hidden beneath his actions and conduct, there is this special relationship between Aba Abdallah and Allah Azza wa Jal. And in addition to philosophy, it takes a very mystical eye to uncover that special relationship. And in order to kind of help manifest these issues, we have with us two guests who are specialists in this field. Firstly, we have Said Ali Abbas Razawi, who is a reciter and a person who's working for our religion tirelessly in different dimensions, and who has focused very much on the idea of the mysticism and philosophy associated to the path of Ahlul Bayt. And with us is Sister Rebecca Masterton. Sister Rebecca Masterton is an academic, a teacher, a lecturer, a scholar in her own right, who has written at length about this very topic, and is also very much interested in the esoteric dimensions of this faith, including Aba Abdallah and Ashura. And so join us in a discussion which promises to have depth and inshallah is useful for everybody on Ashura and mysticism. When people look at the day of Ashura and the events leading up towards it, it's sometimes easy to focus on what's clear and what's manifest, the journeys of Imam Hussain, who he speaks to, the political aspects, and that which seems apparent. But it seems lying underneath the exoteric, there is this esoteric journey happening, which is not really accessible unless you look for it and pay attention. Something deeper with Imam Hussain, which is not like other journeys. So to set us off this difference between the exoteric and the esoteric, Sister Rebecca, if you could begin, how do we look at Ashura and see what's lying underneath? How should we look at it to manifest those hidden realities?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Well, a few years ago, I did a talk actually entitled Imam Hussain alayhi salam and materialism. And so what struck me with regard to this particular topic, which I think is what Islam encapsulates anyway, is the rejection of inordinate, desire for the world. So, submitting to your desire to the extent that you lose sight of yourself, you lose sight of what's right and wrong, you lose sight of the truth, you lose sight of everything, because you're just focused upon what it is that you want to get in terms of worldly status or property, wealth, and so on. And this is, something that Islam came to change. Arabs, as we know, were very tribal, still are actually, divided into tribes, but there wasn't a belief in an afterlife generally, and at least among many of the polytheistic Arabs. And there was, of course, the obsession with tribal honor, and that you constantly had to avenge someone if they, insulted your tribe or insulted you. So with the coming of Islam, as we know, Bani Umayyah saw that not for what it was as a universal message, but as a kind of insult to their tribe and a threat to at least to their branch of the family of the Quraysh. So they just simply wanted revenge. They were still thinking in terms of vendettas, and of course, Islam had gathered a lot of followers, which brought in with it quite a lot of wealth and property and potentially power that could be exploited. And so, of course, people are going to jump on that. And Imam Hussain alayhi salam embodied the opposite of all of that. So it's, what he stood for was absolute submission to Allah, to the divine, submission to the extent that you're willing, you're willing to give up, worldly benefits for the sake of a higher truth, for the sake of a higher way of being a human being. So so this was, yeah, I guess a rejection of materialism, but an embracing of we could say like higher values, I suppose, spiritual values, an acknowledgement that the core part of the human being is connected to the immaterial. So Islam is a way of life that incorporates both material and the immaterial. So
beautiful. Yeah, very beautiful. Say that it seems then that in a world of tribalism and materialism that Sister Rebecca has kind of painted for us, Imam Hussain, he's something different. He's something distinct in that environment.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what's been said. I'm going to just think aloud and basically just try and paint a picture, freestyling the picture. The way that I see it is, I think everything starts off with the absolute. So it's Allah. And for Allah to create another in and of itself is a process. When you're absolute, it's a process. You have to form another kind of universe to where you are to be able to create another. And so for me, the term spirituality is, it's one of those terms which are very difficult to explain God through. Spirituality, or a spirit, or that spiritual realm, is where angels may reside. Those beings that don't have a physical appearance. But that in itself is a hijab. So Allah is the absolute. You could say that the first realm, the first hijab that's created is that hijab of spirituality, or that spiritual realm, so to speak. And then after that, you have the physical world, which is a second realm. Now, we as human beings are residing in the physical world. There's a third hijab as well, and that's our ignorance. And the fourth is our sin. And so therefore, by the end of it, we're actually stuck far away from Allah. And because of that, we suffer. The further you get away from God, the source of all goodness, you begin to suffer. And why Imam Hussein's entire movement is so contradictory in many ways for the average person is because here's a person who's meant to be suffering at the max, but he's not. The more physical pain and everything else in terms of what we regard as a threshold for pain is put on Imam Hussain. You find that Imam Hussain is, as the hadith says, is the nur on his face, the light on his face is ever increasing, and he's at a state of peace. So that in itself is a contradiction. But I guess the true meaning of life and the true meaning of peace is really connection to God. And so therefore what, for me, Imam Hussain symbolizes is a bridge. That, okay, we're divided from the spiritual realm to the material world, to our own ignorance, to the fact that we sin. And so therefore we've actually created for ourselves a hell. And we live in this world and we suffer, and there's a lot of pain. And regardless of whether you become a khalif or not, regardless of whether you're leading a community or not, the fact is you're suffering. And as much power that you're engrossed in, or as much wealth that you can collect, doesn't seem to give you peace. Imam Hussain seems to chuck all of that upside down. It's almost as if it's a 180. To say that, look, from a position of an individual who may physically seem weak, but what he's managed to do is he's managed to win. And I think that goes back to the fact that the human heart represents the haram of Allah. And you always hear this term inqilab, right? And I disagree with the fact that Imam Hussain was some kind of a social activist moving to create a social reform. That's not the way it is. If that was the case, people would have forgotten him in 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. The fact was Imam Hussain goes to the root of what inqilab stands for, which is qalb, qalaba, movement of the heart. And it was so powerful a movement that we're sitting here discussing him. So I think what Imam Hussain was able to do was break all of those barriers of the heart and to reconnect to Allah higher than a spiritual level, but really at a level whereby he kept his humanity and he kept all the other laws, you could say, of the various realms. And so therefore he was a human being who cried, who bled, who had pain. But the fact is that he was able to connect. And therefore, by proxy, his name is so powerful that we're also able to connect through his name. And this is why the Imams have said that the fastest safina, the fastest basically ship that takes us to Allah, and the widest, which encompasses, so it's not exclusive, but it's inclusive, is the ship of Hussain. Is Imam Hussein's maqam higher than the Prophet? No. But this isn't an issue of maqam. It's not maqamat. It's an issue of what Allah likes. And when he likes somebody's sacrifice, he can do that. Otherwise, look, the Prophet goes around the Kaaba. The Kaaba's maqam is not greater than the Prophet's maqam. He has to go and kiss Hajar Aswad. Hajar Aswad is very small compared to the Prophet, but it's something that Allah likes. The question is not about maqam or maqamat. The real question is here is that when Allah likes something, he'll make it greater than maqamat. So in the sense that he likes it, to get to that maqam requires for us to mourn for Imam Hussain or to come to know Imam Hussain. And this is why some of our friends would say, from the people who are spiritual, the Urafa, would say that the Imam itself is a maqam. He's not a wasila to a maqam, it's the maqam itself. So that's the picture I'm painting at the moment. I'll leave it at that.
Well, in that context, I must, as a follow-up, when you say that Imam al-Hussein, it's a contradiction in understanding the hijab of Allah, where the more he suffers, the more beautiful his face becomes, the more light his face becomes. In the course of that change, what's happening to his heart, where in one moment we see him in one form, and the more that he's suffering, it seems like the more beautiful he becomes. What is actually happening to him as a reflection of this sight?
Taslim is the idea of submission. It's the idea of willingly submitting, and that's what Islam symbolizes. And this is why when you look in the Quran, the true meaning of Islam really is this kind of insightful submission to monotheism. Islam doesn't mention adyan, it mentions deen. There's only one deen, there's only one religion. Well, religion, again, it's a Greek Roman word, but there's only one deen. This is why Ibrahim was a Muslim. Not the Muslim that we can attach to as in us being Muslims of following the Prophet Sharia. Sharia, there's 5 in the Quran has been mentioned. Nuh, Ibrahim, Musa, Isa, and our Prophet. Sharia's changed, laws change. The idea is deen is one. And that primordial religion, or you could say that primordial deen, is what Imam Hussain symbolizes, is reflecting. So, to go back to your question, what Imam Hussain really is doing is, I guess he's living and he's enhancing, is fortifying that deen, which is started from Adam, which then goes through Ibrahim. It's that pure monotheism. And this is why, when you, as one Jewish rabbi said to me, because we follow the Musawi Islam, and the Christians were meant to follow the Isawi Islam. So Islam itself, I think, is a deen. And I guess when you're talking about what's happening in Imam Hussain, I'm just trying to remember your question now. So what's happening with Imam Hussain? Yeah, and the idea of contradiction. I don't think that there is, but he's going through the human stages. I think the pain that he's feeling is very much, we have to remember he's a human being. Otherwise, there's no test. Otherwise, he's not an example. So he's a human being. He's going through, when he cries, he cries. When he cries for his children, he cries. When he cries for his women, he cries. There's hadith that says that as the iman of let's say a man increases, his love for his family, his wife, his children increase. So he was genuinely upset. He was genuinely crying. He was bleeding. He was genuinely in pain. You can't take that away. You can't divorce somebody from that. In fact, to show you human side or humanness is not a weakness. It's a strength. And what Imam Hussain is showing a strength actually, but at the same time he's showing submission, idea of taslim, absolute submission to God. And that's what grounds him in Tawheed. That's why he is a pure monotheist. So that's the way I'm seeing it, because I don't see a contradiction in that.
Beautiful. Sister Rebecca, a question comes to my mind from that remark, which was, if we look at deen from this perspective, where Tawheed has that kind of very deep impact on your heart and developing, that religion seems very different to the rules and laws we follow without understanding the kind of the beauty behind them. So when you look at Imam al-Hussein, we see something, we see almost the reasons behind the laws in the way he acts, the reasons behind the actions. Do you think it's fair to say that Aba Abdallah represents this immaterial thing as well as the material?
Well, we all have the material and the immaterial aspect to ourselves. I think, yes, of course, there is the immaterial, but I think we need to reflect upon our concept of the immaterial as well. I think that over the centuries, Muslims have been very influenced by a kind of Neoplatonic idea of the immaterial, which is almost kind of divorced from the material. And this has led us to seek this kind of almost sanitized, you know, way of being. And in a way, we shouldn't really extract Imam Hussain alayhi salam's immaterial aspect from the material and kind of romanticize it in a way. And I think one thing that struck me a few years back when I was in Karbala, and that was when Muharram was in October, which is when it would have been at the time of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And I mean, obviously, I'm not from that climate. I don't live in that climate, so I'm not 100% accustomed to it. But it did strike me like the sun was very, very intense, sort of blindingly intense, like after Dhuhr. And of course, there's a lot of smoke around from the fires. There's the beating of the drums and so on. There was a lot of kind of impact on the senses, we could say. That was exhausting to deal with. And I went back and kind of, you know, went actually back to the hotel just to have some cool, peaceful environment. And I thought to myself at that time, you know, for quite a few years, I've been saying, you know, when we're talking about the role that women play in Islam, I've been saying how, yeah, you know, the women were on the battlefield, they were dressing the wounds and everything. But that day I came back and I thought, I used to say that like it's so easy. Or, you know, just you say it because you like the idea of it. But you actually have no idea of what the experience is of that. And that day when the heat got too much, the sun was too blinding, the smoke was too much, the drums were too much, the people were too much. I thought, I'm not even on a real battlefield, and I'm feeling like I need to go and take a rest. So what would it have been like? And I think that I've kind of come to rethink my concept of spirituality, as in that spirituality is found in that blood and that dust and heat and you know, clashing of human beings, and intense difficulty, and kind of almost like a type of a darkness as well that hits you, or that you get kind of drawn into. You know, I mean, in our worldly life, we get drawn into dark situations that you don't like, but you have to take it on and deal with it. So we talk a lot about ascension. I mean, this kind of Neoplatonic influenced kind of spirituality focuses a lot upon ascension towards the Nur, towards the divine, but we're kind of forgetting about the dirt, the dust, the heat, you know, and so I almost think that if we're going to kind of even get close to trying to appreciate where Imam Hussain was, we need to undergo those conditions as well. So I mean, you know, even need to be guests on the battlefield to because then, I mean, you're dealing with fear here. I mean, I'm not saying Imam Hussain was, but we as human beings, I mean, how would you be on that battlefield? If we are aspiring to be like Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and we're thinking about how do I get close to his maqam, what was his maqam, and so on, how are you gonna get close to that? unless you have really faced that. You've stared death in the face, and you have been prepared to you've been at that moment where you are prepared to lose your life. So and so that's my kind of concept of spirituality now, is which I feel is kind of something sometimes we miss. Of course, we like to talk about the sacrifices of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, but sometimes when we talk about the spirituality of the Ahlul Bayt, it's almost like we divorce the spirituality from the kind of the worldly not worldly aspect, the earthy aspect, the aspect of being a human being on earth. So those are that's where I am at the moment in terms of thinking about spirituality.
This is such a beautiful reflection about spirituality, that it's not found in running from the battlefield or escaping, that sensory furnace of this world. Rather, it's found within the thick of it and how you respond to it. That really is a beautiful way of understanding Ashura. Sayyid, how has your view of spirituality been affected by Imam Hussain and your reflections on Karbala? Have you come to any realizations as well in your reflections?
Just to build up on what's already been said, I find that the greatest dhikr is not just sitting and reciting Allah, Allah. I think dhikr amali is also very important. And to physically go and to be refined is in and of itself a huge part of spirituality. And what you see with Imam Hussain is a physical manifestation of the dhikr of Allah. That's what you see, and that's what we have to go through, because we've not been created to live in a cave or divorced from the physical sense. The physical world is a huge part of us. This is our playground. And we have to benefit from the physical challenges. Now, by definition, because the world is restricted, being material, anything that gives us any form of restriction causes suffering, curtails our free will. And because our soul is such that it wants absolute, what you find automatically is you're going to suffer. But I guess it comes down to practically going through the various tests. Now, look, if we look at it in this way, or this is the way that I'm looking at it, is that if we've been created to be godlike, which we have done, and this is why our desires are so unlimited, the only way one can become godlike is when they start to share, and share in such a way which is unconditional. The ability to give something up unconditionally without wanting something back. And if you look at some of the more traditional pathways, even if it's across religions, you find this idea of selfless service, the ability to give selflessly, not wanting anything back, and that in itself is a maqam. So when you look at somebody like Imam Hussain, the maximum you can give after giving your family, your wealth, and everything else is what? Your blood, your life. And he gave everything that he had of his. And there's still there's still like a dialogue between him and Allah that takes place at Asr time, where he says, Allah, are you satisfied with me? Having taken everything, to say something like that. And he says, look, if you're not, then take as much as you want. Take everything from me. And that can only come when there's love involved. Because otherwise, without love, there's no way you can do that. So we have to go through physical tests. You will have your heart broken. You will go through physical tests. You will go through difficult moments. And the reason being is that there's no way of advancing otherwise. And this is why there's a particular dua of actually Imam Hussain, where he says, Allah, basically it's give me the ma'rifah before you test me. Because many a time we have to go through tests to get to that ma'rifah, to get to that understanding, that knowledge. And that's, I think, that what it is for the vast majority of us. We will go through tests, trials, and tribulations. It's not a bad thing. In the grand scheme of things, obviously, when you're going through, it's a bad thing. But that in itself harnesses your own spirituality. Basically, you're being formed, and in a way, you're becoming firmer, you're becoming stronger, and you're becoming pragmatic. And this is why we have two hadith which may seem contradictory, but they say the believer is like a mountain. But at the same time, a believer is like straw. When the wind blows, the believer bends. And then after the wind goes, you come back again to that position. So the flexibility of a human being, or when to be strong, when to be flexible, This is all part of life. And there's no way of divorcing the physical with that which is not physical. You can pray for as much as you want, and you can do dhikr and wird and dua and everything else. But until you're not tested, you don't rise. And so I think it's a bit of both, because you're not mujarrad, as I say, you're not immaterial. You are material. You've got a material existence. And so to be able to perfect that is very important. So I think that's what Imam Hussain has taught me, at least over the years. The fact that you're going to face everything. You know, his name was tarnished. He was insulted. And if you look at it, what's the biggest thing? You know, when Imam Hussain himself cries, or the fourth Imam when he cries, it's just because my aunts were called names, like treacherous, rebellious, or whatever it may be. So they had everything attacked. Their name attacked. Their families attacked. Their respect attacked. And through that, they've become timeless. So it shows that if you really want the big, you know, the big prize or the crown, you've got to be ready to be tested at every stage. And yes, there's ways of preserving yourself, and Imam Hussain could have done that. He could have preserved himself because there are ways of doing that, but he didn't. He went for the big test, and so did his family. And that's why he's a different caliber from all of us.
If it's true that the more Allah loves somebody, the more He tests them, then Sister Rebecca, the love of Allah for Imam Hussain seems exceptional, right?
Yes, I mean, there's a narration by Imam Bakr, I think it is, alayhi salam, where, you know, he says that the reason why Imam Hussain alayhi salam was put through what he was because Allah wanted to, you know, bestow a very special status upon him, and I think also to you know, another thing in the middle of all this turmoil and everything that he went through, to have taken the steps that he did and gone through what he did, if we can kind of guess what was his state of mind in some ways, you've got to have a very calm and focused state of mind. So you know, he passed through all of that. It seems, from what we know from the sources, you know, he passed through all of that in a kind of a state of equanimity, you know, state of I don't know about if tranquility is the right word, but always, you know, in a state of balance, we could say. And so and yeah, and that comes from knowledge, of course. So if Allah, as the narrations say, if Allah loves a person, then they they bestow them with knowledge. And even the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam have said that they increase in knowledge all the time. You know, every Friday night they go up to the Arsh, they increase their knowledge. So he would be continuing to increase his knowledge, and he alone is going to have the unique knowledge of what he went through. That's a journey that is unique to him. But of course, he was doing that bearing in mind that he is laying out a path for other people to follow as well. So yes, he would have been a beloved of Allah, as of course as the Holy Prophet was of all the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And I think that, yeah, it wasn't just he's a beloved of Allah because he was made to go through the trials that he was. Again, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says that the prophets go through the greatest trials of all humanity. So the higher status that you are, the greater the trials. And this was a unique journey and a unique trial and sacrifice. So Allah would have, of course, selected him for that because of that love, because of that closeness between Allah and the Imam. which we can only, we will never know. It's between him and Allah. But we can try to follow in that direction. And of course, again, it's a sign that I think that again, especially in this kind of day and age, where perhaps every day and age has had its kind of oppression, different types of oppression that have gone on. I think maybe something that characterizes today is kind of a borderline insanity that we see kind of becoming the norm in culture and in media. So and that is generating psychological, unrest in people and anxiety, and nobody knows where the truth is, or what's the way to go. And so it can look like this kind of state of darkness is going to eclipse everything. But I think looking back at Imam Hussain alayhi salam, he is a sign that of how to follow that way towards clarity and sanity, and not allow your environment to eclipse the situation, or to drive you towards despair, or to drive you off course. He drew out a line, a course for people to follow as an example. Not to say that it's easy. I think we should remind ourselves it's not easy to do that. We're all kind of struggling to maintain ourselves on that path, and maintain that state of equanimity and balance in a world where people are deliberately trying to cause instability and craziness, really, living in a world of much craziness. So which I think is really affecting young people. I mean, I speak to young people, and they need a lot of help. They need a lot of help, and because they just don't know what is what, like where is the way to go, what is going on, and that's all being generated by the powers that be, so to speak. So we all need to try to follow that example for the sake of the next people coming up after us.
Highlighting the kind of, thank you, Sister Rebecca, highlighting the psychological conditions quite important, because if we do look at Karbala, we don't see a kind of anxiety in Imam Hussain. We don't see him having his faith being weakening by any of his trials. And as much as we can enlarge our trials today, they're not the same as holding your 6-month-old in your hand, or witnessing so many of your family members kind of be killed in front of you. And yet, this is a very practical spirituality. It's not the case that Imam Hussain is struggling and saying, after death, I'll be okay. No, it's in his reaction we see his beauty. Sayyid, because Sister Rebecca mentioned children, this is a very practical spirituality. How do we teach people that Imam Hussein's spirituality is not theoretical or abstract, but it's a very real thing? How do we instill that in our community and in ourselves?
Well, I think it's important to make it practical then. I think it's the responsibility of those people who go on the minbar and people who are preaching, that it depends on which reflection we give it. If we look at it from one lens only, and this is why we suffer the way that we are. But if we encapsulate the various different realms and levels and so forth into our discussions, then I guess we'll have more of a practical understanding of what he symbolizes. When you talk about tests, for example, tests are there to raise your maqam. Tests are there to raise your status. And if you look at what Imam Hussain is saying in Dua Arafah, for example, he is a broken man when he prays, but only to his Lord. There's a difference between being broken in front of human beings, and there's a difference between when you're, it's literally, when you read it, it seems like that from all of his existence, all of his wujud, he's just grabbing onto Allah. If you read Dua Arafah and see how he's talking to God, it's phenomenal, and only an Imam can do something like that. That kind of a dua cannot be recited just like that by anyone. I've never come across something like that, and here it is, page upon page, But if you just start reading it and just understanding what he's saying, it's a dialogue that's taking place. It's as if he's seeing God and he's having that conversation. So to make it practical for children, I think we need to look at all the various angles of what this trial and tribulation and this test symbolizes. And it's completely right. We're living in a time of dhulumat and dhalala, and Amir al-Mu'mineen has said that. There's a hadith where he says to one of his companions, it says, Kumail, after Hussein is killed, the world will plunge into darkness and confusion. And before coming of the 12th Imam, the more days go by, what you find is that darkness and confusion sets. You look at Shiism or Islam just generally from 20 years ago, and you look at it today, it's a huge movement, from where it was to where it is now. So there's this confusion and this darkness is spreading, but whereas it is spreading, there is a hope, and that lies in Imam Hussain. I'll give you an example that's coming to mind at the moment. You see, when a person is tested, there's two things, or there's two reasons why you can go through some kind of a trial or tribulation. One is because Allah wants to elevate you, and the other one is a byproduct of your own deeds. Many a time for human beings, at least we could say, if we put a number on it, 90%, is because of our own deeds. It's because we've said something, done something, hurt somebody, and sometimes without even knowing it, you hurt somebody. What happens is that it comes back to you. So this is why you have repentance. Now what repentance does is it removes the effect in the hereafter. But the problem is that in this world, you've scarred yourself. So there's going to be ramifications. The only thing that you find that eradicates the stains from your heart in this world is crying for Sayyid al-Shuhada. And that's why crying is important. That's a practical step. This is why you've been told to recite Ziyarah of Sayyid al-Shuhada. This is why you've been told, for example, on Thursday nights to cry for Imam Hussain. Now this has nothing to do with wajib, mustahab or haram or anything like this. And these are adab, these are ways to understand ishq, understand love. And I think if we can introduce some kind of a mechanism for us and our children or the generations who are coming to understand what ishq is, what the various stages of ishq is. And ishq, again, there's nothing halal or haram about it. For example, if you go to a majlis of Imam Hussain, whether you sit on the floor or sit on the seat, no haram or halal, but you see some of the elders who are 70 plus are sitting on the floor and you ask why. And that's their adab, that's their ishq for Imam Hussain, that even if they've got a backache, but out of the respect, they're not going to sit on a chair. And I've seen this so many times, but now generations don't have that because we're already looking at things from one lens, halal, haram, halal, haram. That's not how it was. And that's not why we've developed in this way. You've got to look at it beyond that, have a wider kind of vision. And for that wider vision to take place requires you to experience things. You must experience things to be able to understand a wider. And this is why, for example, have you ever thought why Imam Hussain travels so much for? Or why we've been told to travel so much for? When you see different cultures, different races, different people, it enhances you as a person. Sometimes it's very difficult and traveling is not easy. This is why he prayed qasr, and this is why you have all the other stipulations. But the fact is that we're being pushed into a place whereby we need to understand more and more about the physical world. It almost seems like, from my perspective, you're told to travel, you're told to speak to people, you're told that if you want to be preserved from the shar, from the evils of a person, learn their language, learn their culture. So everything really is about realization of the other, realization of the world outside of you. And so for this reason, I think the Quran talks about the signs on the horizons before oneself, before you can see signs inside of yourself. So it's almost as if you're being told to get acquainted with the world around you. And when you start to know people around you, you start to pick up on the etiquettes of how to live. And it's not always black and white. So I think if I could go turn the clock back, what I would have wanted as a child or growing up is to have more emphasis on the parameters of how to express oneself, parameters of expressing love, parameters of, let's say, the kind of like the dimension of Imam Hussain, whereby it's not just based on a culture, but more so that deeper connection that's based on the heart. So I think when you can connect your heart to something which gives you peace, and I've seen many people have a different connection with a different Imam in times of trials or difficulty, they call upon that Imam, the Imam helps them. I'll give you an example. Some people, for example, 8th Imam Ali ibn Musa, so when they call his name, when they have something that deeply disturbs them, you find that there's like this peace that flows over their heart because they have this connection. Now, I find that with generations that are coming up, they've not been given that connection. All we know is halal and haram, halal and haram. Again, and there is something far beyond that. There's, again, halal and haram is important, don't get me wrong, but that's not all of religion. Religion is much bigger than that. It's deeper than that. And it's more diverse than that. It's just one facet, which is halal and haram, basically. So, I think a wider understanding, maybe based upon love for children, at least let them know that in times of difficulty, when darkness, because we've all been through it, and believe it or not, all of us have to go through it. The older you get, you've been through it, you've seen it, you've seen problems have befallen you. Us sitting here, we've faced problems individually on an individual level. We've faced heartbreak and pain, and inshallah you may not have done, but at least I have done, going through all of those different stages. But what does it do? When you're able to attach yourself to somebody like Imam Hussain, or that message which is so timeless, there's an energy there which actually lifts you up. I remember a friend of mine used to say to me that, I think it's in Russia, that they say the lowest you can fall is into the hands of God. How much can you fall, right? So the lowest you can fall is in the hands of God, and God raises you. So sometimes you have to be broken to be remolded again. But at the same time, the hope needs to be there that from the very beginning, it was God who got me to this stage, and it's going to be God who's going to take me forward and further. So yeah, I think a revamping maybe of the message is important.
Yeah, well, since we are looking back, it is helpful to look for ways that we've seen this ishq represented in a way that we can copy. Scholars or traditions or mystical paths, or anywhere where we see somebody practicing what you're speaking about, Sayyid, contemporary wise, it just helps us so much. Sister Rebecca, since Imam al-Hussein stands until now, are there any kind of scholars or movements or maybe even spiritual paths which have really shown us what, or have given us a really helpful interpretation for ishq and for practicing this ishq? Do we see in any movements after Imam al-Hussein or in any spiritual paths?
Difficult to say. I mean, of course, I mean, there have been, I think, so many that have been so diverse. So, there's the centuries of poetry, poetic traditions that have taken inspiration from Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and but again, I think there's also been kind of debate and discussion around Imam Hussain alayhi salam as well, and the form that this love for Allah should take, and now we're kind of in an era where Imam Hussain alayhi salam is kind of being secularized in a way. We're in a kind of era of attempts to secularize Tashayyu, we could say. So difficult to say a really kind of that. I mean, again, like the Turkish movement has been different from the Iranian one. It's been different from the Iraqi one. It's been different from India, Pakistan. They've all got their own different kind of characteristics. I suppose one of the things that I've always found beautiful is that everybody with their own kind of attachment to Imam Hussain alayhi salam comes together in their own way, and so yeah, I mean, to name kind of one specific movement is kind of difficult because there's just been so many and that have been so diverse over the centuries. But I would say that, of course, Imam Hussain alayhi salam also gets appropriated, and so there's that kind of subtle line between taking inspiration from Imam Hussain alayhi salam and utilizing Imam Hussain for your own agendas, and I think that's gone on a lot as well. I think the Safavids, they were the ones who supported a lot of the Muharram kind of rituals, we could say, and then promoted that, but then they were also trying to promote themselves. You know, we've had people kind of adopting Imam Hussain for different reasons. And then of course, you know, we've got Mu'inuddin Chishti's famous poem about Imam Hussain alayhi salam as well. But I think one thing I find that is important not to lose sight of is that one of the reasons why Imam Hussain alayhi salam ended up having to sacrifice his life is because people rejected his imamah. So, and we mustn't lose sight of that, you know, I was asked the other day, someone said, is Imam Hussain just a religious figure, or is he universal for everybody? And knowing kind of what's gone on over the last few years with kind of different Imam Hussain movements, I could see exactly what that question was about, in a way. That there's now this kind of movement for, you know, Imam Hussain is for everybody kind of thing. And, but okay, I would say, yes, we can all take inspiration from Imam Hussain alayhi salam, but let's not forget why he had to sacrifice his life in the first place, which is that people rejected his imamah. And so we come back to Wilaya, that we mustn't forget the importance of Wilaya in all of this. And so, yes, we have a lot of kind of diverse poetry and very inspiring and beautiful, you know, movements and gatherings of people, and everyone can take something from Imam Hussain alayhi salam. But if his imamah had been acknowledged back then he wouldn't have had to have sacrificed his life. And so then we come back to asking all the people who are taking inspiration from Imam Hussain, well, back then, would you have accepted him as your imam? Or would you be one of those who, well, we like Imam Hussain, you know, he's a very nice person, but we're not interested in sacrificing our lives alongside him, or trying to understand his status as an imam, and trying to understand, you know, what Wilaya is. So that's the difference. I think now we're in an age where we're kind of muddying the waters between, we all love Imam Hussain, you know, let's all promote this mahabba, as love for Imam Hussain, this love for Allah, the movement of love, because Tashayyu is a movement of love, definitely, without a doubt. It is all about love for Allah, love for Ahlul Bayt, and I think that's the beautiful thing about it, that it kind of it integrates love into that movement, into that way of life. But there's a difference between loving someone because they have beautiful characteristics and they inspire you. There's that love, but there's the love that comes with the knowledge of what that person is doing. What is their life about? What's their message? What's the knowledge they're trying to convey to me? Do I understand? I mean, you can love someone, but if you don't understand like the message they're trying to get across to you, then you know, it's a limited kind of love in a way. So I'm coming back to being quite orthodox, I suppose, or hardline. That, you know, Walaya comes first, so Imamat comes first, and that's the way to, you know, the true knowledge and the true ishq.
Nice. It seems we are in need of some sort of balance, because otherwise it just becomes so convoluted, like you said. On the one hand, there is this secularization of Imam Hussain where you'd never know he was Muslim on that regard. And then on the other hand, you have what you mentioned, a kind of Neoplatonic way of looking at him, where his ideas are so abstract and so theoretical that no one is actually embodying him today. This balance is a rare thing to find. Sayyid, when it comes to the spirituality of Imam Hussain, how do we find that balance today in understanding him enough to know what he stood for, but being able to communicate it coherent enough that everyone can kind of get on board?
I knew the answer to that would be Insani Kamil.
That's why I asked you.
And I find both spectrums are very important. I think that whenever you limit any form of knowledge to one specific tunnel, it becomes detrimental, because people see things through different lenses. We all see things through our own experiences. And today, when Islam is being portrayed as such a negative faith, to have somebody who does appeal to everyone, I don't think is a bad thing. When I see Islam in India, for example, last year, Lucknow, 30,000 people came, Hindus came in one procession. Same thing you'd know about Hyderabad as well, that thousands of Hindus do come. And I think that's not a bad thing. Imam Hussain does call people, different types of people, to his shrine. If today the Dalai Lama wants to go to Karbala, there's a reason why. So he does appeal. And when goodness appeals to someone, that means that their heart is open. They may not have got to the final stages of realization, but to love anything requires two things: free will to love and the knowledge of what you're loving. So there's some kind of knowledge that somebody has, there's some kind of an understanding. So the whole world should really understand Imam Hussain truly for what Imam Hussain is. However, for the rest of our lives, we'll evolve into understanding what Imam Hussain is. What you understand at 21, you won't understand at 30, to what you understand at 40, by the time you get to 50, technically speaking. We should be evolving in a particular direction. Then the question comes in is, what is Wilaya? What does it encompass? Is actually, I would say, is even wider than Imamate itself. Because Imam is an Imam in the physical world. Wali is a Wali in both worlds. Wilaya comes from Wali, right? Allah is not Nabi, He's not Rasul, He's not Imam. Actually, Allah's Wali. So from the name of Wali of Allah, which is eternal in every single realm, that's given to the Imam. And Imam, of course, he's the head of Wilaya. Amir al-Mu'mineen is, alayhi salam, is Wilaya itself personified. But I think Wilaya is far deeper in many ways to understand. There's the Wilaya of love, and then the Wilaya of guardianship and governance. But it's, sometimes one has to ponder deeper. And I think, look, when they say that in the last days, people will be sleeping, and the hadith says it's almost as if, bang, they wake up, that something is there. They wake up to this message of the 12th Imam, alayhi salam. All of a sudden it's like, so that light bulb, you've got to get somebody to that level where they at least have a light bulb. Otherwise you're in darkness. What are you going to press? Nothing. And in the traditions it says that it's not necessarily the Muslims are the first people who are going to come running to the Imam. The reason being is that just because we're in this position, and it's a very unique position at the same time, as a privilege to be what we are, followers of the Imam, but we have so many issues amongst our own selves that we're not actually understanding true Wilaya, what it is. Somebody comes to the Imam, right, and they ask him, they said, what is Wilaya? And he said, there's 7 parts to this. And so he says, can you tell me? He says, look, if I tell you that these 7 things have got to do with hukuk of your brothers and sisters, I'm worried you're not going to be able to do it. It's better you stay ignorant. Wow. But he says, I'll tell you one point of it. And he does mention afterwards what the points are. But one of them is this: what you want for another person is what you want. What you want for yourself is what you should want for another person. Basically, the golden rule. If you don't like people to backbite about you, don't backbite about somebody else. If you don't like people to steal from you, don't steal from other people. It's very simple. I don't find it that difficult. I think in the abstract sense, if we're just able to do that and become better human beings, slowly but surely the Imam opens up a pathway for people to go towards him and to understand him better. As it says, just given one of our hadith, we'll do the rest of the work. And I think sometimes it's important just to show somebody the pathway. Once you've shown them the pathway, you have to have trust in your Imam, that your Imam then will take it further. Because look, my capacity is limited. If my capacity, and when you talk about ulama, it's not the job of the ulama, just the job of the ulama. Imam Hussein's everyone's. I disagree with people who say that it's only the ulama should go and talk about Imam Hussain. What's the point of you going to a majlis or majalis of Imam Hussain from the age of 0 if you can't talk about Imam Hussain? It's not just somebody who fits into a particular category or a group of people. It's for everyone. And everybody does it in their own way. There's possible, you could go and say something to someone which 10 ulama couldn't do, right? Could be very profound. So I think we're all ambassadors, and we'll all pitch it in our own way. We'll all say it in our own way. We'll all say something that can shake somebody, that can move somebody's heart. So, I'm looking at it more universal, and only because of my own experiences, maybe 10 years ago, we'll be looking at that. But through the interactions over the years that I've had with people who may not be Muslim, but who have been inspired by Imam Hussain. And who knows, if you were to ask them on the day of Ashura, would you be there? I'm sure that there are many people who today are not Muslim, but on the day of Ashura, they would be there because they understand that universal message. And some of our more puritanical people can ask that, why are they not Muslim then? Well, actually, it's probably our fault. We haven't pitched it to them in a proper way. Honestly, if you were non-Muslim, would you be a Muslim? Everything that you see in the media, right? And some people come to the pathway. I'm not saying they don't. But the vast majority of people may not have had the right exposure. And I find that when they do get the right exposure, it's like jazb, it's like, pulse, you become majzoob. So I think just to give people, as they say, the crumbs, the taste for it, and you see naturally people come, and they will come. And I think that we have to have more confidence in the message, how we present the message as well. Now, I remember one time, I think many years ago, we were in Marble Arch, and this old lady comes up to one of the guys who were standing there, and the shirts that they were, says, what are you guys marching for? He says, Imam Hussain. Yazid killed Imam Hussain. Says, so what was Yazid then? Because he was a drunkard. She looks up and she goes, well, I drink. What else was Yazid? Committed adultery. Well, says, I've done that in the past as well. And, he couldn't really pitch Yazid in the way that it should be for a person to really understand, okay, why Yazid is bad. So, I think that once we get the right pitch, education, and I find it comes down to love. If we can just give a little bit of that to somebody and then leave it be, let them go and take care of it itself. So, when we talk about, and I know we shouldn't belittle Imam Hussain, just a freedom fighter, Gandhi, Malcolm X, and sometimes we find that we just bunch him up with all sorts of other freedom fight. Imam is Wali Ma'soom. It's a different category altogether. There's no comparison with him and anybody else. But I guess if that little bit of an injection is there of what Imam Hussain is, I don't think it's a bad thing. If somebody doesn't have the same understanding as you or I, what makes the difference? At least there's something there for them to work on. You don't know tomorrow where they turn to, how they turn. It could be better, it could be much better than we are in 5, 7, 10 years. It takes a night. Horror took a couple of hours. So, let's get the message out there. This is my own humble opinion now. I'm not speaking for Islam or anybody else. Let's just get the message out there. And once we get the message out there, let the message do the work. And people will see different sides of it, different shades of it. It's good for them. If they can have some kind of affinity to Imam Hussain, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, it seems we can have both. We can speak about the Wilaya of the Imam, but because Wilaya has so many dimensions, like both of you have discussed, the people will take what they can see. Irrespective of the label we assign to people, they can appreciate Imam Hussain irrespective of their background. And as you mentioned, age and scholarly background, it doesn't seem relevant. And that is the case with Imam Hussain because of the spirituality he gives, it seems, that immaterial, that true way of being, which you don't find in this material world. Yeah, you find it with Imam Hussain. We have come basically to an hour to the end of our discussion. So I apologize, Sister Rebecca, but I think if you had a remark, we have to save it for the next podcast, inshallah. So thank you, Said Ali Abbas, for the last word. Thank you, Sister Rebecca, as well, for joining us, and thank you for the listener for engaging with us. And I think maybe it's good to end on a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And that really is an inspiring note to end things with. It seems like the tests that we go through, the difficulties we go through, make us more beautiful in the same way that the suffering Aba Abdallah goes through makes his heart lighter for the sake of God. This is a very beautiful reflection to take away, and I will draw attention to the idea of balance, which we've discussed. One, in trying to be like Imam Hussain, cannot be too detached from his message, but we cannot stray too far from the universality of his faith. And that's where practicing spirituality and personal development is the answer. Making Imam Hussain useful in your life and an ally in the journey of your soul and your heart towards unity with Allah Azza wa Jal. Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us. And inshallah, we will see you soon in the next edition of Ashura Reflections.